y vamos a abrir un espacio para las preguntas. Las personas que deseen participar, estamos abiertos a escucharlas.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I think it's inspiring, your presentation. Could you please expand a little more about the Dialogue Center you mentioned?
Yeah. Well, the Dialogue Center is, I think, evidence of a number of things. First of all, it predated me. Okay, so although when I was in government, I actually I liked engagement even then. I helped it find $1 million of public funding to do it. It's a wonderful story how the Dialogue Center was created. It was an old bank building that was next to, which had a heritage designation. And next to it was a new hotel that was being built. And my predecessor, a guy named Jack Blaney, who has led one of the most successful, subsequently led one of the most successful deliberative dialogue exercises in the world around electoral reform, which I talked about yesterday. But he saw an opportunity, and he walked over and he walked into the office of the president of this hotel, and he said, "You own the heritage building next door. Wouldn't it be good for business if that heritage building became a conference center? And wouldn't that help bring people?" And I said, "Yeah, it probably would." A guy named Peter Ng, very lovely guy. By the time they had finished talking, Peter had committed to donate the bank heritage building to Simon Fraser University, and Simon Fraser had committed to try to raise the funds to turn it into what it has become, which is that amazing thing. What Blaney then did was he created a programmatic component to support the Dialogue Center, because that facility is designed to enable discussions that are not hierarchical, that are based upon dialogue and engagement of a different kind than you would normally get in an academic setting or in many settings. And so he set up an agency to do, or a part of the university to do that, called the Center for Dialogue as well, but the programmatic center as opposed to the physical center. What had happened is when I became president, my predecessor, very well-intentioned, who did a lot to build the academic reputation of the university, I don't think really had a strong passion for the Dialogue Center and its mission. And so the Center for Dialogue drifted. It became more focused on good things. It became more focused on educational programming in the community. And the Dialogue at Center started to get rented out. So it was rented out for conferences and that kind of thing. So what we did was we reinvested in the programmatic side of the Center for Dialogue, put in a very dynamic executive director, who in turn brought in fellows. That's non-gendered, by the way, brought in fellows. And it's, you know, what's amazing? University is such a great bully pulpit. You may find this too. She was able to get people, former diplomats, people who've been community workers, to come and become fellows of the university and not ask for, I mean, I think maybe they got a small stipend, and they would go out and raise funds for programming that the center would then deliver. Programming on justice, on democracy, on indigenous rights, or international programming on peace and reconciliation. And she really built it back up. And it's just, she's just left. It has a new director who's equally passionate. And we provided some financial support to get it back up and running. But I think a lot of the funding that is being brought in through these fellows and the work that the center does is becoming very close to, if not entirely self-sustaining. And we still do, I mean, the facility is still rented out, although for the most part, my hope is, I haven't checked on this, it's rented out where the center plays a role in helping organizations to use dialogic methods to deal with real and important problems. So, and it's right in downtown Vancouver. So it was a resource that was there. In its original conception, it was very aligned with what we ultimately did, but there was this gap of time where it started to sort of drift. And one of the things I became quite emotional about is Jack Blaney, this former president, came to the university when I was leaving to express appreciation for that, because he really had a vision for an engaged university before it was current.
The other question in regard to the idea of the co-op. Could you explain a bit more? What is the co-op?
A co-op.
Yeah.
Well, co-op education in Canada is a form of work integrated learning. And the way it works is it's also a form of income for students. So the way a co-op works is students will enroll in a co-op program, which will extend their university education. It doesn't replace the academic coursework they do, but the co-op placements they get will hopefully be complementary to those placements. And they will get paid by an employer who can afford to pay. One of my goals was to raise funds so we could also place co-op students in organizations that could not afford to pay, both for the sake of those organizations, but also to give co-op students a much more diverse set of experiences, so they don't simply through their co-op get a view of society that is viewed through profitable businesses, but through other agencies. The co-op placement is one that is viewed as part of their extended academic program. So they are required to do reports on it. The workplace has to supervise them. But one of the key things about co-op, and I talked to some of your folks yesterday about this, about your programming, is the real value. One of the real values of, in my view, it provides a relevant work-related experience where students can gain competencies. It provides them some income, but it also brings those students back into the classroom, and the perspective they bring back into the classroom from the community and their diverse community experiences, really, in my view, in the hands of a quality teacher who understands, can really enrich the classroom experience and can enable the classroom experience to become much more engaging and much more attentive to real social issues, to real economic issues, to real development issues. So one of the real strengths of co-op, and UVic, by the way, where Bud Hall comes from, is Western Canada is very strong on co-op. So SFU is not unique in this. But what co-op can do is really enrich the educational programming. One other thing I'll say is co-op is different than service learning. We also expanded service learning hugely, and that is really volunteer contributions by students. Again, curated by the university to try to provide them opportunities that will be beneficial to them, but unpaid. But what we did was we introduced I'm trying to remember the term, but a notation on their transcript, so they would get credit for their contributions on service learning, so that their transcript would show not only their academic, their co-op, but would also show areas in which they had made contribution and gained knowledge in the process.
Hello, how are you? I would like to know a bit more about the venture labs, especially.
Venture labs?
Yeah, how does it work? I mean, like, are there other actors apart from the university? And on a financial matter, what happens when there's a successful project or idea? Does the university participate as a stakeholder, like further on, or something like that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, some of the research that's generated within, okay, there's a big, I'm going to come at it from a slightly different end, but I'll get there. There's a big debate in Canada about the appropriate model that universities should have for research mobilization on a commercializable basis. So for faculty research, before we get to venture labs, some universities like UBC will take a share of the actual product of the research that's generated by a faculty member and expect to participate in any profit that happens. Other universities like SFU do not take a share. We have adopted the view that the ownership there's enough impediments to bringing things to market, let the ownership reside with the student or the faculty member who generates it, unless they want our support. If they want our support, then they can come to us and we'll say, well, we can provide some financial support for you to get patenting or whatever, but then in exchange, we expect some payback should you be profitable, that kind of thing. So that's a general framework. Venture Labs, though, operates, its funding has largely come from government on the one hand. There was a big federal program some years ago that we tapped into to provide support for incubators and accelerators. And we made a strong case that a university-based incubator and accelerator in an engaged university partnered with another engaged university, which at the time was called Ryerson, but Toronto Metropolitan University. I should have mentioned that to you earlier. Another university very focused on engagement. Had special value because we could draw upon the resources of the university to support entrepreneurs, both research and students. And so significant funding came from government initially, and some continuing funding has come from government. Some funding comes because the entrepreneurs who are located in this co-workspace environment pay a certain amount, not to operate there. We also rent out some of the space from time to time for organizations that want to use it. So there's various income streams there. But Venture Labs does not try to take a share of the value of the enterprise. In answer to your question, the only time that would happen in the university was if Venture Labs happened to be hosting a university-based research or an innovation that originated with university-based research, a faculty member or a student, and the university had negotiated an arrangement in order to support something like patenting or some other effort.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Andrew. Thank
Hello.
you. Very inspiring, as I said yesterday. Well, Colombia is a highly polarized country. In fact, the last report of the consulting firm Endelman, I think is the barometer of trust, not sure. Colombia is the second most polarized country.
Politically polarized.
Yeah. The first, I think, is Argentina. In this regard, polarization not only means division, but what is most worrying, distrust. How can we respond or maybe explore some answers to this polarization from university community engagement?
Okay. Well, let me first qualify what I'm going to say by acknowledging that Canada, thankfully, is not nearly as polarized as many other countries. And the US can't be far behind Colombia these days, by the way. But Canada, I mean, British Columbia has a vibrant political climate with, a left and a right, and Canada does as well. But there's still a sort of culture of civility that so on the Edelman trust barometers and all those things, even though all those same indicators you're talking about show up as declining, I think we're in better shape to start with. But this is going to be true confession time by me now, because I want to be honest with you about this. And the context is this. I was a cabinet minister in a social democratic government, which is a polite way of saying a socialist government in British Columbia. I applied for the position of SFU president, having left the government after 2 terms in office and become dean of law at UVic, which was far enough down that it didn't raise any concerns. When I applied to become president of SFU, the government in power was the government of the other party. And I think the fear was, or the concern might have been, if we hire this guy, it's not going to go well for the university, because he was a cabinet minister for 10 years in the party that defeated and was constantly arguing across the legislature 2 sword lengths with the government in power. So for me, it was really important to demonstrate that what I was doing was not part of a polarizing agenda, was not. So it was important for me to show that what I was doing was not simply a leftist move, even though I am a leftist. I did that in a number of ways. One way I did it was I begged someone to become chancellor who was a former minister of finance for the other party. But the other way we did it, if you look at engagement has many faces. And the economic, you'll see there's a fair bit of this that is about economic engagement that's directly relevant to the business community. For example, co-op provides a lot of students that are, it's a great deal for the business community. You get a co-op student, you get a fabulous student working for your low cost. Some of the social infrastructure we're doing from a government point of view, to the extent we're successful in building social infrastructure, it puts less pressure on them to have to invest in social infrastructure. That certainly wouldn't be my message to them. I would hope they would invest on top. It would be additive. But I did work hard to make sure that the theme of engagement was not simply one that reflected a transfer of wealth and power to those who were less advantaged. Although I would say that was my priority. But I would make sure that we would deal with the business community. We'd talk to the business. I mean, a lot of people in the business community are upset because they don't think universities are relevant enough, right? They say, oh, a bunch of academics. So I could show that an engaged university actually had aspects to its engagement that spoke to the relevance of the university in terms of training students who really had an understanding of how to become entrepreneurs, or training students who had a better understanding of the social context so as to help business to be more successful in addressing Aboriginal issues, for example. So we worked hard to emphasize that what was good for society was good for business, was good for government, even though those governments weren't aligned. Now, the good news for me was about 7 years into my mandate, the government changed. And it became less of a political concern, but I still think it helped the university to gain social license, that this was not seen as simply an agenda that had a place on a political spectrum, but could work across the political spectrum. Whether that makes me a sellout or not, I don't know, but makes me a realist. Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning. I would like to ask, how receptive was the community with the university initiatives? As we could talk yesterday, for some of our university process, as in Peace and Region, the construction of trust relationship sometimes take a lot of effort and a lot of time from us. So I want to know, what were the strategies, the particular strategies that you use for maintain the people interest, if you had them, of course. And when I say the people, I'm talking about all the possible actors that as university we can work with.
Yeah, really important question, and one that certainly merits a lot of thought and consideration, particularly if you believe that community engagement is about being in a mutually respectful relationship with the communities you're engaging with. And I hope it does, that you're talking about co-creation of knowledge, you're talking about collaboration, and to build that trust and the sense of mutual understanding and respect can be really hard work. It played out differently in our case. There were certain parts of it that were not particularly challenging if we're dealing with sort of fairly well established organizations. For example, there is a very significant Sikh population in Vancouver, quite well organized. And my predecessor had set up an advisory council, and there was a lot of trust. It had been predetermined before I got there, I think, but I don't think I think they were more ready to trust the university simply because they were economically more self-sustaining and not as disadvantaged. But when we're talking about Indigenous communities, or we're talking about the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is the poorest district in Canada and beset with huge intersectional issues around poverty, mental health, drug abuse, dislocation amongst Indigenous people, it becomes a real challenge as to how to do that. So how do we try to do that? On the Indigenous side, it was a matter, I think, of really reaching out to Indigenous people and, first of all, giving Indigenous voice within the university. not just having one or two Indigenous faculty, but making a real effort to hire more Indigenous faculty to create support systems for Indigenous students, so as to show Indigenous communities that we were providing a place in which Indigenous people could not only participate in the regular life of the university, but could impact the university, could shape the university, could bring Indigenous knowledge into the university. That was hugely important. It happens in small and incremental steps. I created a program called the President's Dream Colloquium. It was a fancy name, but essentially was I gave funding for faculty members who wanted to put on unique courses that exemplified engagement in some way. And one of the courses that was done that was really transformational was a course on Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge. And it was offered by elders in Indigenous communities in partnership with faculty members, some of whom were Indigenous and some of whom had a lot of experience in Indigenous communities. And that course was I mean, it was transformational in terms of bringing people within the university into an understanding of how to work with Indigenous knowledge seekers and the like. I also gave an example, I think, about a research project we did called the Hakai Network, where our researchers worked alongside elders and others in Indigenous community in trying to understand the marine ecosystem for development of an economic platform. And there was a lot of training that went on in helping those researchers to understand how to work, and a lot of ceremony that had to take place to condition people. I mean, one of the things, if you're an academic and you want to go in and you want to be in and out in 2 days, it's not going to work. So a lot of cultural, cross-cultural work within the university, a lot of bringing more students and faculty from Indigenous communities into the university to inform the university, to help sensitize the university, to educate the university, to make Indigenous knowledge an important source of knowledge within the university. So when we then reach out and deal with Indigenous communities, we're not reaching out as the other, we're reaching out, and they're not the other, we're reaching out as a body. But it's tough work. It's tough work. It's hard to do. In the downtown east side, one of the slides I showed. There. SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement. This is an office that's located right in the downtown east side of Vancouver, one of the poorest areas. And the idea was, we have our School for Contemporary Arts in this area, was to use the cultural capacity of the school to work with the community, to bring community members into productions, to have community members working on productions, to also reach out and do community programming. And we just have had, I'd say, we had an extraordinary director, he's still there, Am Johal, who just spent hours and hours and hours working with the community and trying to find ways to demonstrate that SFU was not there to gentrify the community, but was there to provide social infrastructure and support. I wouldn't say it's been unqualified success, but I would say there's been some real headway made. I'll tell one of my favorite stories. There's a guy who had the vision for SFU to do this in the downtown east side named Jim Green, who was a real character in Vancouver. He was a real fighter for workers. He was a strong socialist. He was also a fan of opera. And when the School for Contemporary Arts first opened, which is the year I became president, he asked if he could do some community programming to help build the relationship that he believed was possible between the university and the community. And he decided to put on a program about opera. And people said, "This is crazy. You think people in the downtown east side?" He said, "Absolutely." And so they sent out posters and pamphlets and invited all the street people in the downtown east side, come, we're going to have a program about the opera. They'll be singing, there'll be all this. And there was some skepticism about that. And the morning that the first program was to be offered, Jim Green walked down the street to the front of the building where it was to be held. And there was this was like a fairly new building, so no one was really knowing quite what to do. And we had a security firm that was helping with the downtown campus. And there was a big security officer standing outside the building like this. And Jim Green said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Oh, I'm here to keep any undesirables from coming into the building." He said, "No, you're not. Get in there. Go behind your security desk. We're opening these doors." And so the doors were opened, and Jim was right. There was this huge turnout from the community that came, and it was apparently, I wasn't there, unfortunately. It was before I think it was, if it wasn't before I became president, I certainly wasn't aware of it, but a big turnout, a very successful event. At the end of the event, one of the people who came from the downtown east side and who was really down on his luck. He really looked like he was a street person, but he needed to use the washroom. So he walked inside the facility to find the washroom from the room where they were having this event. And a new student who just come there, looked at this guy and got worried, went over to the security guard, who happened to be the same security guard. And he said, hey, look there, look there. Don't you think you should do something? That he's trying to come into the building. And the security guard said, "Oh, don't worry. He's from the opera." And what Jim said was, and I don't want to exaggerate its impact, but it's always stood with me. He said, if we can produce that degree of social transformation bit by bit by bit by bit, we will build trust. We will become an agent for positive reform. Because he said in that one moment, you had a person from the street who suddenly saw this facility as a facility for them, not just for the opera, but for its use for the washroom, as a community facility. You had a student whose perception of this person as some kind of threat from the outside was transformed into, no, he's from the opera. And a security guard who went from trying to keep this person out to making it possible for him to come in. I would like to think that we were replicating that experience over and over again. I'm not sure we were, but it is an example of how tough it is, but also how it's possible to really make change if you work at it in small but concerted ways.
Good morning. Pues my question is, what strategies does the engaged university implement in order to close the gender gap? Do you have any successful stories? It's not something, of course, there's still work in process in Colombia, and we are still working very hard in order to close that gap.
Well, among students, I'll go with the easy part first. Among students, the gender gap in Canadian universities generally, and SFU in particular, generally is in favor of women, about 60% women. But there is a serious gender gap in certain disciplines. I think we talked about that. And so we have a program and thankfully some supporters who have been working very hard to increase the representation of women in applied sciences in particular. It's interesting, I think we might have talked about this, that in some, like in environmental engineering, which was a new program, the representation of women, I think, was like 35 or 40%, but in other more traditional engineering, it was more like 15 to 20%. So we had a very progressive donor who created a scholarship program specifically to try to draw and make possible women coming into these programs, into the programs in which they were underrepresented. And I would say we have a strong commitment to gender equity and throughout the university that we try to work on, and at the student level has, as I say, is not a concern, is not so much a concern across the entire university, but is a concern in certain pockets. In fact, I'd actually say, and this is led by women, the concern has gone the other way in some students. There's a sense that males are not, for whatever reason, are not attending university in the numbers that they should, for their own benefit and for that of the community. At a faculty level, this gets tougher, right? The faculty level, because of the history of hiring, there's no question there's still significant gender imbalance in numbers and even more gender imbalance in income, because the senior faculty who are older and have been there longer tend to be much more dominant, males dominate to a much greater extent. However, there is a real effort that I think is bringing about a major transformation, so that we are seeing much greater representation of women amongst the professoriate. To the point that I would say the greater concern now is around diversity generally, about representation of Indigenous people, Black people, people of other insular minorities has become a major concern of my successor. Now, I'll say one other thing. In terms of administration, the administration was majority women. And the person who's now the president, Joy Johnson, was my vice president research. So we did a very good job at the senior administrative level of having a administration that was, I think, sometimes equal representation, at sometimes more women than men, but not very good on diversity. And so that's become more of a concern. But certainly gender equality is a continuing concern, not only within universities, but within business. There's a lot of work that is being done by the university to promote gender equality more generally. We're done. Well, look, I just want to thank you. It's been this session, but indeed the entire visit that my partner Maureen and I have had, and Professor Maloney back there at the back of the room, to this university has just been extraordinary. I have learned a whole lot. I hope you've learned even 1/10 of what I've learned from you in our involvement here. Probably from Maureen, you learned about 30%, and maybe from me 10. But it's been inspiring to see what you're trying to do, and I believe universities have such capacity that has not been realized for the most part, to really be agents of social change, to address the big problems. There's all sorts of impediments to it, historic impediments, structural impediments, political impediments. But those impediments make it all the more important, in my view, that we don't give up, that you don't give up, that you look for every opportunity you have. And as far as I'm concerned, from what I've seen, you're looking at a lot of opportunities. You've taken on a big set of challenges. I really wish you well in them, and I hope that you succeed in them all. But even if you succeed in half of them, you'll have made a major, major difference. So thank you so very much.